Hey, it's Kendall here, and today we have our 10th block in our Brackman quilt along. This has been really fun for me to put together so far, and today's block is a little bit simpler with just, well, actually, I'm not going to give that away. Without much further ado, let's spin that wheel and see what this week's block will be. Week number 10, we'll spin that wheel again. One, 6, 8, 4. Brackman ID 1684 gives us the Indiana puzzle block, which was by Ruby Short McKim. McKim Studios was in Independence, Missouri, and was a mail order source for patterns. She also syndicated a newspaper column with full-size patterns in the late 1920s and 1930s. So here we are once again with all of our pieces cut out as per our pattern, and that little inset there that you can see in the bottom left-hand corner. This block is just made up of half square triangles and a square on point block for the center. So on that vein, we will start with our half square triangles, which sees us taking all of our A squares and drawing a diagonal line on the wrong side of all of those. We'll match those up with right sides together with our C squares, and I'm using a directional fabric, so you'll see me doing that in two different directions. Here I've got them placed vertically and horizontally, and that just allows me to control the direction of the half square triangles coming towards the end. So now that we have all of that done, we will take that to the machine and stitch 1/4 of an inch on each side of our drawn line. After doing so, I like to give these a press to settle those stitches down before cutting them in half along that drawn line, and then we'll press all of these to the darker of the two fabrics. Once we've got that done, we are ready to trim these down, and you can trim your half square triangles in whichever method is your preference. I do mine 2 at a time by making sure that I have my pieces nice and snugly nested along that seam line. I then bring in a square ruler that has a 45-degree line on it. I place that 45-degree line along my stitching line, and I make sure that I have enough fabric outside the trim down measurement of 4.5 inches on all 4 sides, including underneath the ruler. We then trim away those first 2 sides. We can spin this block around now carefully not to disrupt our nesting. Place our measurement of 4.5 inches on those freshly cut sides, making sure our diagonal is still on our stitching line, and we can trim those final 2 sides. We need to do this to make a total of 8 half square triangles. With our half square triangles now all made, we'll move on to making the block for the center, or the unit for the center of this block, which is a square on point. Throughout this video, I'll be showing you how I do that by just putting a sew and flip on all 4 corners. When I do sew and flips, as you will or may or may not be aware, I do prefer to use the folded corner clipper tool. I sometimes use it as intended, and other times I just do whatever I feel. In this instance, you can see that we've placed the smaller square in the corner of our larger square, and I always like to do my sew and flips on the top right hand side, and then I know whether I'm going to get it going the right way or not. We line up all the markings on the folded corner clipper tool to the 2.5 inch line because that is the size of our smaller square, and we then trim away the excess and we can take that to our machine and stitch our 1/4 inch. Once that's done, we'll press out away from the center of the block towards the darker of the two fabrics. I'll get the other two corners done and we're ready for final block construction. If you feel you struggle with the accuracy of these square on point blocks, you can print one of the foundation papers from one of the earlier patterns because we've used this square on point quite a few times. We now need to just lay this block out, paying special attention to the way that the half square triangles are actually oriented. So I'll put the little inset there on the top left hand side. Once I've got this laid out, you will see that because I played around with the orientation of my fabric at the half square triangles stage, that I have all of my dots running down the block in a vertical fashion. Now these dots aren't really directional, but to me they were directional enough for me to take that extra step and pay attention to how the fabric was placed. Once we have this laid out, you know what we're up to. We apply our 9 patch construction rules. We'll start by doing those vertical seams and then our 2 horizontal seams. Pressing for our rows here is on the top and the bottom row. We will press in towards the center block. That allows for our center row to be pressed out away from that square on point and puts our fabric away from a lot of the bulk. Throughout, I actually make a slight error in my pressing, and I'm not sure if I've left the footage in on just where I correct that. Then we'll come to do our horizontal seams, and for our horizontal seams, every intersection will nest if you've followed my pressing. With all of those intersections nesting, we just sew those 2 horizontal seams, and I believe that I press away from that center row, but we'll see when we get there. Okay, it seems I didn't press away from the center, so while reviewing this footage and recording the voiceover, I've actually spun those intersections to open them up, which doesn't surprise me because I generally do that when working with half square triangles, as it introduces a few more extra layers of fabric to that intersection of our seams. So we're just going to pick out the few stitches that are on the outside of the horizontal seam we just sewn from our vertical rows on both sides and both intersections. We can then open those up and spin our seam allowances around, and it'll match the direction that your vertical seams have already gone. So that could be in either a clockwise or an anti-clockwise direction. So if you watch here, what I'm going to do, these seams go in a clockwise direction, so I'm going to push those 2 horizontal seams in that fashion, and it comes around like a nice pinwheel. On the other side, they are going anti-clockwise, which is quite usual, and sometimes you need to pick out those few stitches that may still be caught in the middle of that seam allowance there. To deal with the bulk from our square on point, I'm just going to put a little clip into but not past the stitching on either side of that point. And now we can get this seam as flat as possible and take it now and give it a press and settle everything into place permanently. I do like to spin the seams, as I said, because where your half square triangles come together, you double the amount of fabric that is in that intersection, and spinning them around like this just spreads that out a lot more evenly and gives you the flattest block possible. I'll get the other horizontal seam done now and repeat that process, and our block for this week in essence is done, but stay tuned because you know I've always got more for you. If you are wanting to make this block using your AccuQuilt, you can, and you need shapes 3, 5, and 6. 3 will make all of the half square triangles that go around that center unit, which is the square on point, which is where you will use shapes 5 and 6. So what would this block look like on repeat? Well, here we go. So it creates a few secondary patterns, which once you change up some of the colors in the block become a lot more evident. Here is also what it would look like just separated by some sashing and cornerstones just in the original one color layout. And then I thought to myself, what would this look like on point and with some of the colors changed around? And this is what I discovered. Alrighty folks, that's it for another week of our Brackman Sampler Sew Along, and I was happy to be able to provide you with the AccuQuilt for this one. As I said, some of the upcoming ones, only pieces and parts will be able to be done by AccuQuilt. The other pieces, yeah, you can do them quite simply, but I couldn't find AccuQuilt pieces for them. I will see you all again next week. Bye for now.